So I think one of the best guides, one of the best ways that we can improve our writing while we're working on different parts of the stories that we're writing, we can ask ourselves, is it interesting or is it boring? And read it through that lens. I know that what I personally find interesting, most people don't necessarily find interesting, and that is fine. We're living in a world today where it is easier than ever to reach audiences who have the same interests that we do. And as long as I find it interesting, and when I'm working on a story, if I look at it and ask myself, realize that the reader is looking at our stories from a certain angle, and actually they're looking at it through a very reduced and minimal point of view. So we have to ask ourselves, from the reader's point of view, is our story interesting? What usually happens with me is I have a story idea that I find interesting, and the way I write it, I think a lot of the times the reason I'll change it is because I think it's written in a boring way. So I just need to find a new strategy about how to tell the story. As an exercise, take a look at one of your stories, a short story or a story you're working on, and deconstruct it. Write down what is interesting about it, what makes it interesting. As an example, let's use the vampire as an example. We all know the concept of vampire in the world of vampires, and it's a very interesting, the whole undead needing to drink blood, killed by a stake through the heart, having to dig up graves. All of this is very interesting. It is very possible to work with all those interesting concepts, and still, if you wanted to, you could write a very boring vampire story. If the story you're working on is working with some very interesting concepts, that does not necessarily mean the final product is going to be interesting. On one hand, we want to write for our own interests, especially if you're not totally into mainstream fiction. If your interest lies somewhere outside mainstream fiction, as a writer you might find yourself wondering, well, I find this interesting, but will other people find it interesting? If you find it interesting, you can find a way to make it interesting for other people that will find it interesting for the same reasons you do. And if there is something that is interesting to you that is not in the mainstream, you might have a great advantage. You might be on your way to a new discovery. This is to have an interest that is outside of the mainstream has a lot of potential and should be nourished and like a rare plant. You should take it and take care of it and help it to grow as much as you can. On the other hand, you must realize that writing is sort of like this point of constriction, where what you're working with on the writer's end is its own thing, and then what the reader ends up getting is a whole different picture. It's almost as extreme as someone trying to communicate through a telegraph. You want to work on your strategy about exactly how you're going to send that information down the line to your reader in a way that they can get the best picture of what you're trying to convey. There are so many ways to make your fiction more interesting that all of the ways have not even been discovered yet. It's like scientific discovery. There is possibly no end to ways of making your fiction more interesting. But as an example, let's look at predictability. For the example of the vampire genre, you could write a vampire story that is so predictable that every word that every word that the reader reads, it feels like they know exactly what's going to happen, and there's nothing at stake. There's nothing left up to chance. But one thing you could do to make that story more interesting is that you could have, now if the story looks very much like it's going in the direction that the vampire is going to kill off everyone in the remote village. Introduce a worthy adversary. Introduce someone who you can't really tell who's going to win. That you make it seem very much like the story could go either way. When you introduce that unpredictability factor, the interest level goes way up. Say you're writing a story about a town at the base of a dormant volcano, and at the end of the story the volcano erupts and everyone dies. And there's something very interesting about this story, and if it's written event after event, it could be a boring story just because the reader has no idea the volcano is going to erupt. So if you have some way, if you find ways to make very clear in the reader's mind all the possibilities of where the story could go, if they have a clear idea, all the powers that be in your story, the different competing and interacting forces of change in your story, find ways to make them very clear to your reader. One of the forces of change is that dormant volcano. One of the forces of change is the populace at the base of the volcano. If you like these videos about writing, please encourage me to make more by taking the time to check out my website, solomation.com, where I'm putting up video episodes of the story I'm working on. If it is a possibility in your story that the volcano could erupt, find ways of making that more of a possibility for the reader, so that this is something that they can have in mind during the different events. You could have a character who can't decide whether to move or not, a character who has no idea that the volcano is going to erupt, and the character may have no idea that the volcano is going to erupt, but if the reader also has no idea, then the story is not interesting scene per scene. When you're deconstructing your story, ask yourself, what are the powers at play in your story? How are they going to interact? What are the possibilities of what can happen? And have I made that clear in the reader's mind? Be true to what you find interesting, and have that be the guide. If you ask yourself, if I were a reader who picked up the book and started reading, would I find it interesting or not? Would I find the dialogue interesting? Would I find the characters interesting? Would I find the location interesting? Would I find the storyline interesting? And have that be the guide. I have a few scenes that I think are interesting enough, but my subconscious keeps bringing them back to my mind, and these are scenes where the character is going through difficult times. And my concern is not the story itself, but the way the story is written is oppressive. Instead of it being interesting and exciting, I think it's written in a way where the character is just taking load after load and dealing with it. And it's a part of the story an important part of the story that I want to make more interesting. So I brainstorm about it. How can I bring the element of surprise into these scenes? Remember, this is fiction. You're not writing autobiography. You're not writing history. Every element of the story is open to change. You can drastically change the things that occur and the way the characters act and who they are, as long as they're still fulfilling the role they need to fulfill to move the plot along. I could have the antagonist do something really awful to the protagonist at the very beginning of these scenes, and then afterwards I could go into how the protagonist secretly buys a map at the corner store and finds an old bike and hides it in some tall grass. But because I put that really awful scene at the beginning, the reader is still wondering. They're still thinking of the situation that the protagonist is in as a volatile situation. So it's just a matter of strategy. It's a matter of being willing to rearrange your story to make it more interesting. The overall story you're not changing, just it's the delivery that you're changing. The reader still has very clear in their mind that my protagonist is in a difficult situation. One of the best things you can do is get your subconscious on board. Make very clear in your mind, write down on a piece of paper, I want to work on strategizing for more interesting stories, and look at the story you're working on and ask yourself just once for each story, how can I rearrange things to deliver it in just a little bit more interesting ways? And the clearer you think about this on a conscious level, the better your subconscious will understand what you want, and will step up and help you out, and will bring things to your attention that were never brought to your attention before. You have something that is many times better than a supercomputer at your disposal. It is your subconscious. Always, always, always cut yourself plenty of slack. There's no point at going about this in a negative way. If you're working on a story, it doesn't have to be maximum interesting. You just ask yourself, how can I make it a little bit more interesting? And don't sweat it. Just have fun and continue to look at the whole exercise as a way that you can entertain yourself. I'm a positivist, so instead of looking at it in terms of how do I keep it from being boring, my strategy is to look at it about, okay, I have this story, I think there's something there, I want to get at the kernel of what makes it interesting. How can I make it more interesting? And instead of being concerned that it might be boring, enjoy it for its own sake, for you, the writer, and your story. While you're working on it, if you're interested in the activity, that's really all that matters. And part of enjoying becoming a better writer is to ask yourself, how can I make this more interesting? Can I tweak it? Can I turn it around? Can I add a scene that might transform the story for the reader? Just by asking yourself, is my story interesting to the reader? You'll find yourself, as long as your subconscious is when you ask that question enough, your subconscious starts asking that question and starts providing options, and more often you'll find yourself having revelations about the story, realizing that the way you set up the story can be set up in a way that provides a more interesting journey for the reader. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button, leave a comment, and subscribe, and please get the word out about these videos. I hope your writing goes great, and have a good day.